All right. I see folks are trickling in. And I want to first start off by saying good morning and thank you for joining me today. My name is Justin Goddard. I serve as the Associate Director for Leadership and Education here at Community Progress. And I'm really looking forward to spending the next couple of moments introducing a systems-based approach to vacancy. And my goal for this session is to introduce many of the concepts you'll learn about in later sessions and really provide a big picture foundation for how all of these different ideas work together to comprehensively address and prevent VAD challenges. So as a quick overview, we'll start by briefly recapping some of the concepts Alan introduced during his opening session. We'll introduce the property revitalization framework, and we'll talk about how communities interested in comprehensive solutions should begin putting framework principles to use. So before we dive into the revitalization framework, I do think it's important to quickly recap some of the concepts shared during Alan's presentation, as they really inform why a comprehensive approach is necessary. While every VAD property has its own reasons for appearing, from a systems perspective, they can all be explained by what we've called the cycle of vacancy. Each of the cycle's components provides context for understanding how widespread systemic vacancy comes into being and why that decline can be difficult to break out of. Inequitable development policies and practices often set the stage for widespread vacancy. Our nation's land use policies and legal systems, both historic and modern, operate in ways which perpetuate VAD properties in communities across the country. Policies such as redlining, racial exclusion from federal home lending programs, exclusionary zoning, and others were intentionally created with disparate racial impacts in mind and have left Black and Brown communities more prone to the vacancy cycle. VAD properties often first emerge as a result of economic, social, and natural triggers. These triggers can shift conditions both immediately or over time and can include such events as natural disasters, economic downturns and loss of industry, public health emergencies, shifts in consumer needs and desires, and more. Now, in a community with very high property values or demand, the odds are good that people will likely repair properties impacted by these kinds of events. However, if the property lies in an area impacted by weak demand or inequitable policies, the risk becomes higher that they'll stay abandoned because people simply don't have the resources or it doesn't make economic sense to repair properties. Once VAD properties emerge, their presence can cause consumers to lose faith in a community's trajectory and trigger problematic behaviors. Homeowners may start to neglect maintenance obligations to a property. Property taxes might become delinquent and missed mortgage payments may occur. There's often an increase in speculative buying by outside investors hoping to profit from a future market rebound or just extract any remaining value before walking away themselves. These behaviors ultimately create more deteriorated, absentee-owned REO and abandoned properties and really further entrench the vicious cycle of weak demand. Finally, VAD properties produce deeply damaging impacts on community health, wealth, and stability. They affect personal and public health by exposing people to unsafe buildings and by attracting crime and gun violence. They negatively impact surrounding property values and create conditions where costs to repair properties dramatically outweigh their overall value. They lower local government's ability to generate revenue for services such as parks and schools, while simultaneously generating increased need for services such as fire and rescue to address safety concerns. And the last thing I want to point out here is that each of these elements is fueled and strengthened by the presence of the others and can create an environment where systemic vacancy becomes entrenched and widespread extremely quickly. So looking towards how we address bad properties, we understand that while they're not responsible for every challenge a community faces, their presence absolutely exacerbates and compounds those challenges. Most decision makers are deeply aware of the harms bad properties present for communities and therefore set out to address them as quickly as possible. Oftentimes, local governments will establish purely punitive systems to hold individuals accountable and to remove bad properties when necessary. When funding allows, they'll typically identify and demolish the worst properties, which present a clear and imminent threat to the health and safety of the neighborhood. And boom, the worst properties have been removed and the major bad challenges have been resolved. Decision makers might then move on to demolish properties in other neighborhoods on the other side of town. Additionally, the local code enforcement department will likely receive complaints about the other deteriorating properties and will issue violation notices requesting that owners bring their property back into compliance. So we're done, right? Like everything's been solved. We've solved the issues. Well, when we fast forward a few months, the place where a house once stood has now become a place for dumping trash and other waste. The owner of the property that was not in compliance doesn't respond. Violation notices continue to be sent with no impact. Court dates regarding the violations are missed, and neighbors are left asking, why isn't city doing anything despite a number of attempts? Other properties in the neighborhood have either started or continue to decline. Meanwhile, there are residents who genuinely want to fix their property, but who face real fiscal challenges in doing so. Without any formal mechanisms to provide support or establish partnerships to direct those folks to resources and services, these owners are also faced with the same punitive measures. So ultimately, this didn't work and has only left us with more challenges. And my hope is that this is something that is familiar to many of you on the call in your own communities and trying to really address vacant properties. But why didn't this work? Oops. To bring it full circle, this approach doesn't work because it does not address any of the vacancy cycle components which pull and keep properties in decline. It just provides a one-sided solution to a many-sided issue and doesn't address any of the equity issues. It doesn't address weak demand. It doesn't consider the nuanced needs of community members, and it often just creates more problems. So here at Community Progress, what we advocate for is an approach to addressing bad properties which interrupts the cycle of vacancy through tactics which utilize carrots and sticks, and with an eye towards equitable decisions and outcomes. A comprehensive approach to addressing bad properties considers all the interventions needed to remove root causes and focuses on contributing to healthy and safe communities. The Property Revitalization Framework is a system created to do just that through efficient, effective, and equitable policies, practices, and processes. So for the remainder of this presentation, we'll spend some time briefly discussing the tools and partnerships contained within each framework element and why they are critical to tackling the faulty systems which contribute to bad properties. So as we alluded to, There is no silver bullet to doing this work. As people working every day to address bad properties, I know that each property has its own unique challenges, and therefore one tool will never be enough to solve these issues. Some tools must be deployed in a number of ways to respond to different situations and really require us to rethink how tools traditionally used in a punitive manner can be modified to effectively address the issues as well as build trust with neighbors. Addressing bad properties needs to be collaborative, both within city halls and local government offices and across sectors with local nonprofits and resident leaders. There are a number of people, departments, and entities that are all working to address community harms and who should be brought into the same conversation. Lastly, a comprehensive approach recognizes that property decline occurs in stages and that solutions must provide avenues for addressing residential properties, commercial spaces, and vacant lots alike. While much of what we discuss is focused on stabilizing and repairing physical property, we ultimately do this work in service of people and the places they call home. We believe that effective solutions center equity both in their decision-making and outcomes. This means helping neighborhoods recover from divestment through intentional approaches to reinvestment, centering community members' voices and conversations on how communities should look and where and how investment should occur, and recognizing that different situations demand different approaches. A heavy-handed approach is really not going to work with neighbors that lack financial resources and can lead to more inequitable outcomes. So let's quickly walk through the 4 framework elements and their associated tools. First up is cultivating property owner compliance. And the goal of compliance is to maintain stability and confidence in a neighborhood trajectory by 1, ensuring properties remain healthy and safe places for community members, and 2, enabling compliance when a property has become deteriorated and is causing harm. To reach these goals, preventing property decline must be a priority, and ideally, this happens with the least amount of local government intervention as possible. Housing and building code enforcement refers to the laws and policies that help establish and enforce minimum standards for healthy and safe neighborhoods. When we talk about code enforcement, we aren't just talking about the inspectors that review properties. We're talking about a broader system supported by a wide range of local government actors, from department and division managers to city attorneys to hearing officers and judges and others. Code enforcement can be used to achieve some goals, but first, property maintenance, dangerous building, and nuisance abatement standards need to be established. Those standards need to be clearly articulated to community members. Resources need to be made available to those community members that are willing but simply unable to fix their properties. And incentives need to be created through grants and loans to provide support or fill in the value gaps of conducting repairs. Similar to code enforcement, the property tax system can also provide some carrots and sticks to enabling compliance and preventing decline. Communities can institute tax incentives and exemptions for encouraging compliance. Communities can also relieve property taxes, provide payment plans, and link community members to struggling with making tax payments to other resources. Finally, for those intentionally negligent owners, communities can use property tax enforcement procedures to compel owners into compliance with their taxing obligations. Now, if compliance efforts worked in every case, this would be the end of the presentation. However, we all know that many VAT properties are stuck in a condition and that additional tactics must be employed to move them toward remediation, including transferring them to new owners. In many communities we work in, code enforcement efforts are stretched very thin, and tax collection efforts may be ineffective for fostering compliance on properties where people have walked away. We often see cities continuing to cite properties for code violations that have been tax delinquent for over 5 years, and the owner is either nowhere to be found or it's owned by an LLC. Communities should be thinking about how they can preserve code enforcement efforts for properties where action may be more effective, and look to tools that enable the transfer of property to new responsible ownership where enforcement efforts have failed. And before moving forward, I just want to be very clear here. When discussing property transfers, we are talking about those properties causing the most harm to communities. These are the properties which are clearly vacant and abandoned and present clear health and safety violations. One tool is property tax foreclosure. When property taxes are not paid, a lien can be placed on the property for the unpaid taxes. For those unwilling to comply with the property tax obligations, enforcement efforts can be made by way of foreclosure, and the property can then be transferred to a new owner. As part of this process, there should exist opportunities for owner redemption and other payment arrangements. Where the existing delinquent tax enforcement system is insufficient to compel transfer, communities should explore the local government's authority to leverage key housing and building code enforcement policies to compel transfer. Communities should also explore the use of eligible third parties who are able to abate problems at the property through tools such as conservatorship and receivership. Many communities make decisions on which properties to take through the foreclosure process based on the likelihood that there will be an interested party at the sale to take ownership. A network of viable end users committed to responsible ownership is critical. This network should consist of private, public, and mission-driven nonprofits who are committed to responsible ownership and helping triage properties in need. This network should also include owners interested in various properties, including 1 to 4 unit residential properties, large-scale residential and commercial properties, and vacant lots. In situations where immediately transferring properties to new long-term owners is not an option, communities will need to consider tactics which allow for temporary holding and maintenance. When the cost of improving and even demolishing a property exceed its market value, communities need temporary options and stewards who can prevent the property from causing further decline and harm. For these properties, another owner, typically a public, a quasi-public, or mission-driven entity, might need to temporarily hold and maintain the property until a viable owner who can repurpose that property is found. Temporary holding and maintenance is meant to guarantee that there's an entity responsible for ensuring properties are no longer causing harm and that bad property issues are being addressed. While held, similar property compliance tactics can and should be used to maintain properties such as boarding up windows and doors and mowing lawns. Often, these kinds of compliance activities can be completed through partnerships with local mission-driven organizations. A very popular tool for temporary holding is a land bank. Land banks are quasi-public entities which focus on converting bad properties into productive uses which support local community goals. The most effective land banks are established to acquire properties through the tax foreclosure process, can extinguish back property taxes, and clear property title issues. Most land banks hold properties in a tax-exempt status, and unlike most public entities where they are tied to selling properties to the highest bidder, land banks have flexible disposition powers and can dispose of properties in ways that align with community goals. So the final framework element contains strategies for ensuring properties are repurposed in ways which yield lasting community benefits. And the goal of this element is that properties have responsible long-term owners who are able to maintain them with little intervention. Properties, especially those with several public interventions, should ultimately be transitioned to responsible owners and uses which align with community goals. Oops. Community members ultimately know what's needed in their neighborhoods, and local government should work with communities to develop clearly articulated visions and use those resources as guides for decision-making on in-use of properties. Communities experiencing an increase in the amount of vacant land should develop management plans to determine long-term uses for these properties. Lastly, local governments should form partnerships with organizations advocating or advancing innovative ownership models, such as community land trusts, to foster long-term community benefits. Local governments should consider how they are spending their current resources and whether those funds are adequately advancing community goals. They may also consider dedicating available funds to support building repairs and imaginative reuses of bad properties. So all of these elements implemented in an equitable, efficient, and effective manner can maximize community benefit and foster strong, equitable communities where bad properties no longer exist. And one thing I really want to note here with the framework is that it is most impactful when tools from each of the elements are considered and used. If one or several components are missing, properties can remain stuck in the system and the cycle of decline can continue. So I'd like to wrap with some thoughts on how communities can utilize the framework to begin developing comprehensive strategies. And the first place to start is by gathering your partners. You should consider questions such as who is already working on bad properties, who in City Hall might be interested in a partnership, are there private and community partners that are interested in this work, and most critically to me, who is often missing from these conversations. From there, you should gather and analyze local data to better understand the systems causing bad properties and where opportunities for interventions exist. Both the conversations with partners and the conditions illuminated by your data will ultimately help determine the right mix of framework policies and practices that can most effectively turn the tide on vacancy in your community. And with that, I'm going to open it up for a few questions. I'm actually going to just take a quick moment to look at some of the questions that have come into the comments box, and I will be right back. Okay, I have a question here that I would like to answer. And it's more of a comment, but it allowed me to kind of open up the discussion. It says, the main question everyone asks here is, why haven't you built a new house on the vacant lot where you tore the old one down? And one of the things that we like to encourage here at Community Progress is that, the solution doesn't always have to be a new building or building exactly what was there before. The solution could be returning that land back to nature. It could be turning it into a side lot for the neighboring owners. One of the things I want to point out is that we have a whole database on our website of vacant land reuses. which really showed just the broad imagination of community and how people are really taking vacant land and using it to solve other issues such as lack of access to healthy fruits and vegetables, offering space for people to meet other community members and build community, and places to really sort of embody the spirit of the community and its history. So that was one question that I saw that I wanted to answer. Let's see. So I want to answer this question. It's basically getting at sort of if, as a community organization, we want to support code enforcement efforts, what are the things that we should be prioritizing? And I think the one thing that you should really think about is that as an organization and people rooted in a community, you all have a unique viewpoint that code enforcement and folks who, yes, they come and they're building relationships, but they don't live in the community, may not get. So you should really think about that and the power you bring to those conversations. In that, I think the example I always use is, let's say you have a vacant building in your community and there are children who play in that vacant building. Code enforcement may not see that because they may come out for a few minutes one day a week to see the property, but they're not going to see that, oh, this property is critical to get, to address because children are playing in it versus another property where that's less of an issue. So I just want to really just empower you to be that voice and be that lens for community resident. I mean, not for code enforcement as community residents who are rooted in the community. Just looking for one more question since I am running out of time. Someone has asked, I can't find the comment, but where can I find land banks in my community? We actually have a land bank map on our website. If you go to our website and go to the land bank resources page, there's a map of all the land banks that we are aware of, and it's growing. So, please feel free to visit our website to find more information on that. Let's see. So I want to kind of answer this question. I know that we're going to talk about this a little more, and it's a little bit sort of within our wheelhouse, but kind of broadens sort of the view of the work that we do. I don't think that necessarily community land trusts have a negative impact on property values. I think the key thing about a community land trust is that what it is doing is it is not necessarily, it is removing properties out of sort of the speculative nature of property markets. So what it is basically doing is it is allowing the opportunity for folks to live in a property and not have to worry that, oh, the property values are going up, everything's going up, and now will I be able to continue to live in this house? It's really kind of centering property as places where people live and kind of less so as places that are impacted by markets and things of that nature. That's just my thoughts on that question. But I think that we are at time. We may be a little over time. I do want to just say thank you for attending this session. I hope that it's been very helpful for everyone, and we'll hopefully see you all at our conference this fall. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap.